All right, this is nerve-wracking. Hard to follow Debbie. So first of all, I want to congratulate everyone who presented today. Just wonderful ideas and presentations, and I'm honored to work and study with all of my colleagues. My name is Angelo, and I will be presenting today on emotion AI and its risks, opportunities, and policy implications. So first, I'll be defining emotion AI, and then I'll go over existing applications of this technology. I'll discuss the problems, and then I'll propose policy options and their implications. So first of all, what is emotion AI? Emotion artificial intelligence, at its simplest, are technologies that detect or recognize human emotions through machine learning algorithms. They're being used and experimented in various applications across sectors, such as health, education, law enforcement, the automotive industry, and in the workforce. It's predicted the industry will be worth over $90 billion by 2024. There's excitement over the potential benefits, but also tremendous concern regarding privacy in the collection of biometric data, reliability and accuracy of the predictions, potential high-risk harms for people's lives in high-stakes contexts like employment and housing. So there are a couple of different definitions, and I'll show some of them here. The concept is known by many other names like empathic AI, affective AI, affect recognition, but for the purpose of my research, I'll use the term emotion AI. So on here, I include some important individuals, and I'll highlight two individuals. Rosalind Picard is the pioneer of the field of affective computing from the late 90s from the MIT Media Lab. And Kate Crawford, author of the Atlas of AI and one of the directors at the AI Now Institute in New York City, which called for a blanket ban of the use of emotion AI in the 2019 report. And there are some key similarities in these definitions I put up here. And mostly it's around computer algorithms that detect, measure, understand, and maybe react to human emotions. So in terms of my definition, I break it down to four key factors: detecting and recognizing emotions by using biometric data to predict and infer emotions through machine learning algorithms, and then to make a decision and act on the results. Emotion AI relies on a variety of biometric data collected by different sensors. This includes facial expressions, iris scans, body movements, physiological responses like heart rate, skin temperature, and breath, as well as voice and tone. So a couple of different use cases that I'll go through. Some of the less risky applications of these technologies include advertising and marketing, driving, and romance. Affectiva, which is a spin-off from the MIT Media Lab, leads some of these use cases. So for advertising and marketing, it measures the emotional reaction to ads or movies or TV. And in driving, it detects drivers' fatigue, maybe warns them to take a break. And for romance, apps like Replica allow people to make romantic connections with an AI-generated avatar. So there are some problematic use cases for this. And one of the big uses of emotion AI is in employment. It's used in hiring through video interviews, especially during the pandemic where we haven't had the person-to-person hiring. People are scored on characteristics like grit and smiling, but that could also cause issues for racialized people and differently abled individuals. These technologies are also being used for law enforcement, including iris scans for lie detection and border enforcement. And probably the most scary is that it's being used for children's toys and education, making sure that school children are paying attention in class or giving kids a virtual friend. But are there a couple of benefits to this? One of them might be in terms of treating mental health. Counseling and cognitive behavioral therapy could benefit from emotion AI. Interacting with children on the autistic spectrum, and recovery for stroke victims in reconstructing their smiles, for example. But there are a lot of problems that I'll go into in the next couple of slides around emotion AI. And the first really important one is the lack of scientific accuracy. Studies show that emotion recognition is not consistently correct and is based off of flawed scientific methodology. There's also issues around bias and discrimination. Studies of commercially available application services, or APIs, carry racial bias and can affect people's civil rights. There's also a risk of substantial harm for wrong decisions, including in contexts like housing, loans, and employment which can significantly affect an individual's life. As well with children, one of our most vulnerable populations, and sensitive health decisions. Do we want emotion AI to make diagnostic decisions on things like mental illnesses? As well as surveillance, lack of disclosure use, the use by law enforcement and potential violations of privacy. All of this adds up to the issue that Canada's current regulatory framework does not adequately affect the substantial impact that emotion AI can pose. And most international jurisdictions do not have sufficient safeguards for emotion AI. So in terms of other issues, kind of going into the literature on this, Dr. Lisa Feldman-Barrett conducted a meta-analysis of hundreds of emotion recognition scientific studies over many years. She found that facial expressions are not consistently correlated with their expected emotion, undermining a basic premise of emotion recognition. And moreover, Dr. Barrett found that in emotion inference of facial expressions, images are often labeled with a wide variation of emotions. So for example, a scowl is often interpreted as anger, but it can also represent concentration. And lastly, emotion recognition drops to even lower accuracy rates when used in the wild outside of ideal lab environments. Another study by Dr. Lauren Rue of two commercially available emotion AI APIs, Microsoft and Face++, consistently rated Black faces as having more negative emotions. Using images of NBA players' faces that were publicly available online, Microsoft calculated that Black players are 3 times more contemptuous than white players, and Face++ calculated Black players are 2 times angrier, 3 times more afraid, and 20% less happy. And even more so when Dr. Rue controlled for smiling by using 2 players that were both smiling, Black player Darren Collison and white player Gordon Hayward, Face++ calculated that Collison was 20% less happy and 180 times angrier, and Microsoft 5% less happy, and even hinted at a bit of contempt. As well, in a study of APIs used on children's faces, researchers Bryant and Howard found that these APIs perform poorly in correctly identifying children's emotions on average. The results ranged from 43% to 67% matching score, or true positive rate. The APIs were more than 90% accurate in detecting happiness, but they were actually shockingly inaccurate for fear and sadness. For Effectiva, they only calculated fear correctly 8.88% of the time, and Amazon for sadness 10%, and Kairos for sadness 18.5%. So in response to these problems, I proposed and analyzed 3 policy options to address these issues in the Canadian context. The first is to create a federal registry and mandate algorithmic impact assessments, or AIAs. The second is to develop new provincial anti-discrimination and privacy legislation, which I based on a recent white paper by the Ontario government. And the third is a federal biometric data legislation governing the collection and use of these kinds of data. I think we also need to begin investigating just how widespread the use of these technologies are in Canada, but the policy solutions I propose have wider consequences in addressing other emerging technologies, such as facial recognition technology, but also being anticipatory of the increasing use in Canada of emotion AI. So in terms of creating a federal registry and mandating AIAs, the principles around this are around transparency and responsible stewardship. It's to require operators of emotion AI systems to register with a federal regulatory body, and as well as undergo a third-party AIA or audit asking how the tech works, how the data will be used, data protection measures, and what are the risks. This regulatory framework can learn from other jurisdictions, including, for example, a New York City law governing the use of emotion AI in hiring interviews, and ensure that there's a balance and scope of how this registry would work. But there are some potential problems which make me hesitant to actually recommend this. It's unclear what regulatory body would actually take on this work. Some individuals like NDP MP Charlie Angus recommend that the CRTC be responsible for regulating AI. However, I argue that it would actually be beyond the mandate of the CRTC, and at the same time, it would be difficult to create a new regulatory body, and it's difficult to set up a system with high operational costs. The second option is to implement the provincial anti-discrimination and privacy legislation. The principles around this are around preserving human dignity and mitigating harms. So under the Constitution, the provincial jurisdiction has responsibilities around labor, health, and education, where I said that that Emotion AI has probably the greatest impact. In a recent 2021 Ontario white paper on updating the province's privacy legislation, the government is considering updating the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act for the digital age. So in particular, this white paper points out the concept of automated decision systems and creates rights for disclosure, contesting decisions, and requesting human reviews of decisions used by these decision systems. There are also higher responsibilities for systems that can, quote, significantly affect the individual. And this is where the provincial government can further clarify anti-discrimination measures on automated decision systems. This includes applications for housing, job hiring, and other employment issues like promotions or termination, and financial applications such as loans or insurance. And the government should also consider protecting children by prohibiting the use of these systems for children under the age of 18, as well as their use in schools. The province can also regulate the use of these systems in making health diagnoses. The implications are that this is an outcomes-based regulation meant to mitigate harms, creating a regulatory framework that ensures proactive disclosure, liability, and consumer rights. Lastly, I recommend enacting a new federal biometric data legislation that prioritizes privacy, the concept of duty of care, and liability. It might be argued that the Personal Information Protection and Electronics Documents Act, PIPEDA, covers biometric data already. But the existing legislation is ambiguous on modern collection and use of digital biometrics. With the concerns I've outlined earlier, it's actually important to create a clearer understanding of the responsibilities of firms and placing higher thresholds on these more sensitive data. It's recommended that proposed legislation explicitly include language that specifically addresses technologies or systems that use biometric data, which includes not just Emotion AI, but also facial recognition technology, advertising, and other technologies. But for the purpose of Emotion AI, the language should address systems that, quote, recognize, predict, infer, or analyze an individual's emotional state. In terms of a strong measure, applications covered under this language should be prohibited because of the lack of scientific accuracy. But at a minimum, these applications must have responsibilities like explicit consent, the right for an explanation, and appeal of the decision. The legislation should outline.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Could you please very quickly wrap up because you are over 12 minutes.
Okay. So what I'll quickly wrap up with is that I recommend that provinces should consider updating their privacy legislation for anti-discrimination, and that the federal government should enact the biometric data legislation law that establishes minimum responsibilities for operators. And that I would recommend a ban on the use of Emotion AI in high-risk applications that could significantly affect an individual. To wrap all of this up, these recommendations will hopefully prevent or mitigate the potential harms these technologies might have. But with a broader biometric data legislation, it will also address greater issues around these data. These measures might be difficult to implement, and they are admittedly blunt policy solutions, but the cost of not doing anything is too great, as these technologies will be increasingly used in many sectors. This is not just a future matter. Emotion AI is here in Canada, and it will only grow in use in the coming years. Thank you.